Where are Australia's missing $100 notes? The invention of plastic banknotes has been the single greatest invention for criminals, business, and everyday people. A nearly indestructible banknote designed perfectly for illicit activity and the criminal underworld. This new form of cash can be stored under mattresses, inside of shoeboxes, or under the floorboards without deteriorating. In Australia, the note of choice for laundering and bulk cash smuggling is the 100 note, known affectionately as the Melba, due to the face of the legendary opera singer Dame Nellie Melba featuring prominently on the note. In November 2021, the Australian cash supply surged above the $100 billion threshold, up 20% during the pandemic. The Reserve Bank of Australia estimated that between half and three-quarters of physical cash was being hoarded. The notes favoured by launderers, 50s and 100s, represented 94% of the cash in circulation. In effect, there was somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000 being hoarded under the mattress for every man, woman and child in the country. This raised the question, where were Australia's missing Melbas? Steve Worthington, Professor of Finance at Swinburne University Business School, said most Australians rarely come across the highest denomination banknotes. When was the last time you had a $100 note in your pocket? When was the last time you withdrew one from an ATM? Professor Worthington raised serious questions about the use of these banknotes in the black economy. From an Australian perspective, we might argue those who benefit most from $100 banknotes are either tax evaders or engaged in criminal activities or both. It seemed that no one at the RBA or anywhere in government really knew how much of this 100 billion cash mountain was being used to sluice the illicit economy. In response to a request from Canberra, Australia's central bank issued a research paper that attempted to solve the mystery of the missing Melbas. The paper investigated the scale of banknote hoarding and attempted to quantify the associated illicit activity. The RBA said in its paper that between 15 and 35% of the banknotes circulating in Australia were being used to facilitate legitimate transactions. Around half to three-quarters of outstanding banknotes, they said, were simply being hoarded. The RBA's optimistic assessment was that only 4 to 8% of outstanding banknotes are used in the shadow economy. These estimates were highly questionable, however, in view of other domestic and international research. The Big Four accounting firm KPMG studied the Aussie shadow economy in 2018 and estimated it was worth $32 billion each year. The Australian Bureau of Statistics had already judged that the underground cash economy, that is, tax evasion, amounted to around $25 billion per year. When drug trafficking was added in, KPMG concluded this figure rose to $32 billion annually. Yet these optimistic Australian numbers, which suggested the shadow economy sat at a modest 1.5% of GDP, was still vastly lower than independent international estimates. Research from the Institute for Applied Economic Research at the University of Tübingen in Germany, for instance, found that Australia's shadow economy, primarily tax evasion, accounted for a whopping 9.4% of GDP, or more than $150 billion. When illegal production and organised crime was added in, the number rose ever higher. The Australian National Audit Office, in a 2002 report on the cash economy, said the cash economy may range from 3.5 to 13.4% of GDP. A 2017 International Monetary Fund working paper, authored by Leandro Medina and Friedrich Schneider, said Australia's shadow economy was likely to be between 12 and 13% of GDP. Even the government's own Black Economy Task Force estimated in 2019 that the shadow economy was larger than the RBA's modest figures suggested, around 3% of GDP or $50 billion. The RBA's estimate that 92 to 96% of Australian cash was being used for lawful purposes was looking statistically untenable, even laughable. This raised several deeper questions. Why would the RBA, as the issuer of the nation's banknotes, want to downplay their use in the illicit economy? And why, especially given the central bank had itself been implicated in foreign bribery in 2018, was it declining to include an internationally accepted range of offences, including bribery, in its definition of financial crime? When the RBA's researchers asked Aussies why they hoarded cash, people came up with a range of justifications. Not surprisingly, these explanations rarely involved confessions of tax evasion, cocaine purchases, welfare fraud, money laundering, or other criminal activity. Instead, the justifications included emergency transactions, faster withdrawal times and lower fees, cash gifts, savings for large purchases, privacy and anonymity, preparing for payment system outages, and mistrust of banks. Well, at least the last of those justifications was not a fib. Those with large physical cash holdings may be less likely to participate in a survey, the RBA said, dancing around the elephant in the room, and even if they do, might be hesitant to respond with the true extent of their holdings. The RBA's paper also noted, the existence of asset means testing for various social benefits in Australia, and more generally, the desire to hide assets from tax authorities also provides an incentive for Australians to hold assets in a form that is hard to trace. Of course, any estimate of the size of the Australian shadow economy involves a degree of speculation, given the criminal world's inherent opaqueness. The central bank and other researchers cannot know for sure where illicit cash is flowing, as the criminals' fundamental aim is to avoid detection. Despite these challenges, the RBA accepted that consumers were hoarding thousands of dollars at home, as much as $15,000 for a 3-child family, for emergency transactions, birthday presents, or ATM outages. This was an extraordinary conclusion for such important research into the dark economy. The truth is, criminal innovation always moves much faster than the RBA. Criminal markets in Australia have evolved significantly over the past decade. Drug dealers aren't just using cash. The insidious criminal economy has spread even further to encompass payments in cryptocurrency and with contactless terminals passing the money off as business income. They are skipping the cash placement stage and going directly to the layering and integration of dirty money. Many crimes are being executed online. In 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic locked people in their homes, fraud and digital scams skyrocketed. Aussies lost an estimated $851 million to scams, a record annual amount according to the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, ACCC. This evolution had changed the volume and nature of dirty money, and the law enforcement community would need to adapt with it. Throughout 2020, the world of crime was mutating faster than the coronavirus itself, and governments were struggling to keep up. The ACIC, meanwhile, was one agency that wouldn't be left behind. It pointed to a number of disturbing categories of criminal activity that were being excluded from official statistics: identity theft, cybercrime, investment and financial market fraud, card fraud, illicit tobacco and firearms offences, intellectual property theft, human trafficking and slavery, and child sexual exploitation. These were crimes that were corroding and in some cases decimating Australian society. And the laundering of those criminal proceeds had become a lucrative industry in its own right, hoovering up between 5 and 10% of the gross profits. All in all, this was a massive hidden industry. But the RBA, the issuer of the country's $100 billion cash mountain, had failed to appreciate this evolution. Downplaying the criminal abuse of the nation's physical currency had also allowed the RBA to argue that the burden of fighting financial crime rested with commercial banks and other business sectors, not with the central bank itself. This abdication of responsibility would have huge flow-on effects for the nation, as it was self-evident that tackling the source of financial crime required a coordinated, whole-of-society approach. The RBA's paper had promised to answer a question in its title: where's the money? In truth, the report might just as well have been titled, "Nothing to see here, folks." Please move along. Australia's banks and casinos and the financial intelligence community, however, had no option to live in this comfortable complacency. They were seeing a very different scenario play out in the real economy. Its consequences would ultimately prove catastrophic for victims of financial crime, for the banks and business community, for law enforcement, and indeed for the entire Australian community.